The image on this month's chronogram is by Georges Malkine. It's his Dame de Pique, or Queen of Spades, from 1926. It is an oil and collage. The collage element of this painting is the queen at center and her reflection, both of which are cut directly from a playing card. The proportions of the painting itself also imitate the proportions of a playing card. The kind of calculated disorientation that is so important to the surrealist aesthetic is in part here caused by the fact that while the queen and moon are reflected backwards, the spades on the shoreline and the pink brick tower in the distance are reflected correctly. Collage itself was an art form that was explicitly based on a kind of arbitrary juxtaposition of objects that were placed with absolutely no predetermined idea as to how they would fall. And that kind of chance-based art was essentially founded in a kind of psychoanalytical approach to art as being a form of taking dictation from the psyche. The fact that Georges Malkine is somewhat obscure in the history of surrealism is really his own doing. He hated crowds, he hated gatherings, he hated any kind of attention brought to himself, he hated self-promotion. He was bad at all of them and wanted it that way. One of the most common themes in Malkine's painting is chairs, and they're always empty chairs. And I feel that this is very much connected to Malkine's own interest in spaces that are abandoned by people. In the early part of Malkine's career, he was fundamentally interested in space and architectural fragments. Later in life, when he started painting again in 1948, he developed a much more broad thematic base. He experimented in abstraction, he experimented with nudes, and he experimented in portraiture. The portrait is something that he ultimately turned back on itself to be, once again, architectural representation in his series, the demeures, or the dwellings, which are simply buildings with no people in them, but they're named after people. Malkine left France in 1948 for the United States, where he lived until 1966. And during that time, he did not correspond with any of his old friends from the Surrealist movement. And in fact, many people had written him off as dead. He was that out of touch. And this is all part of the kind of cagey personality that is Georges Malkine. The kind of persistent self-erasure or absenting himself from history that Malkine did was very successful, and he really has, in a way, fallen off the map of art history. I can only hope that if he is indeed watching from whatever hall of obscurity he has consigned himself to, that after all this, he might not find fame to be all that bad.
I got to know my father as a person, not as a surrealist. He was basically a kind man and very passionate man, but quietly. All his passion went into his work. He was very smart, very worldly, very well educated, and very funny, but also very sensitive. He could be offended very easily. He could turn very serious very quickly. His painting was not always the same style like a lot of famous painters. He tried new techniques, he abandoned old styles, looked for new ones. He had the leisure to do that. When I asked him about that, he said, well, anyway, the idea for the painting is the most important thing. He was a man of ideas, and his paintings expressed a depth of thought and or feeling and or possibility and or impossibility, or both at the same time. Eventually, you would come to know him by his style of expression, not necessarily his style of painting, whatever that might be at the time. And not all of his paintings were surrealistic. Some were just graphic or stylistic propositions. André Breton said of him that he had a brilliant gift for expressing the ineffable. His paintings came from his inner explorations. Breton had explained that the dream world is parallel to the waking world, but that he believed that in the future there would be a resolution between the two, and that it would form what he called a surreality. And my father's paintings are, I feel, snapshots of this continuum. that Breton was talking about. My father wrote about the absolute necessity of staying in touch with his sensibilities and his impressions from childhood. And despite all he'd been through, 2 wars and myriad kinds of human experiences, he always preserved his sense of wonder, his sense of the marvelous, and the belief that every canvas should be a new adventure